A few more people jump on. I just want to thank everybody for logging in on a Sunday. Conveniently, they moved the Chiefs game for me, so that's good. So it's an evening game. We'll get that later. But I wanted to. We had talked about this before, a bunch of us, about this idea of drills, and Doug Kechijian had touched on it several times about what is the application of drills. Some people are saying people are doing too many drills, people are making up drills. Other people are saying, no, it's a very important thing to have as part of a teaching process. And I'm going to get Mike Hurst to start off, because I'm going to segue into his sort of introduction. But I have some notes here. In 2003, I sat in Charlie Francis's TV room there. Mike, you've been there before. And he's just started talking about drills. So I started writing down notes and recording some stuff. And so I have a little transcript here of what he said. And he said, drills are designed to assist in the development of more complex movements by allowing them to be broken down into smaller pieces. In sprinting, drills can be used to develop improved stride mechanics, posture, arm positioning, and numerous combinations of these qualities. While drills can assist athletes and coaches, inappropriate application of drills can also interfere. In many cases, mistakes in sprinting can be magnified by drills. Tightness that can develop during the performance of a drill, particularly when the drill is complex, can easily interfere in sprinting and transfer into sprinting tightness. In such cases, it is better to stop doing the drill than to struggle through it. This is very common in the case of hurdling, where the drill for the lead and trail legs can interfere with actual running mechanics. So there's more here, and what I'll do is I'll circulate this document to people. But the other point he makes here is that he classified drills as either active or reactive. And active drills are used to teach new skills to athletes as well as strengthen them, while reactive drills are re-educational, or used to correct improper techniques that he would see in a session. So if somebody looked like they were off with their arm or their posture, he'd pull them out, use the drill to re-educate them as to what the proper technique was, reinsert them back into the run, and see if it corrected it. So those were a couple of the points that he made. So I'll try and post that for everyone to see. But Mike, as I thought it was a good place to start, track and field, linear sprinting. What are your thoughts on drills, and how do you use them for just the basic running athlete? You can talk about hurdling as well, but as just a running athlete, what are some of the initial things that you do with young athletes? And then what are some things that you do to re-educate along the way?
Well, firstly, Derek, thanks for throwing me in to follow up a genius like Charlie Francis. It's no pressure.
You got to throw a genius. You got to throw a genius in after a genius. Come on.
Thanks. Well, firstly, I don't start the sessions with drills. I don't ever work with a new athlete with drills. I want to see what they move like to begin with, and maybe later in the session, or one or two sessions later, we can get down to drills and just see, whether we can improve a problem, or whether they were just nervous and tight on just meeting us. New introduction to a new athlete. Some athletes you use drills just to try and enhance neuromuscular coordination a little bit. And some people need technical adjustment, correction. And some are, like in basketball drills, the ball handling drills are very complex. Then they're brilliant, and I love those. But for track athletes, I try to keep it as simple as possible, and as long as there's no leakage in the movement patterning, so that we do try to not collapse or buckle at the knee too much, or at the hip, dropping a hip. You can say that drill probably is starting to work. But what we see too often is people that just throw drills in there as the warm-up, and a lot of people don't need that drill. I remember one of my first Olympic finalists, Darren Clark, used to lose his rhythm when he had to do technical drills. And so coming into the Olympics, 10 days out, or even a couple of more than that, maybe 6 weeks out. I just said, look, just sack every drill, forget everything. Just run natural, native. And we reshaped his running pattern just through doing the right distance to repeat over. So, for example, he didn't do anything shorter than 150 metres in his running. And that enabled him to open up and really stride out. Whereas before we were doing lots of this sort of choppy patterning and all the rest of it. And the guy was taking 3 steps on the same blade of grass, you know. So you can kill people with drills, or you can make them with drills. That's what I would say. And you need to be very, very careful before you introduce them. And most people will benefit from it, particularly people who've been badly coached from the start, and that would be most of them.
Yeah, because I would go to track meets all over the continent, really, and I'm seeing people, and unfortunately it was warm up, and I'm seeing people butcher drills and warm up, and I'm thinking about what's the impact of this going to be on their performance, or does it matter? Like, is it, you know, if you do it as part of warm up, is it just moving? Like, are they moving? Is that a good thing? Or do you think there could be a detriment if they're doing these drills improperly and just kind of throwing them in there?
One part of me says there's no such thing as a bad drill, you know, and then there's another side of me that says, you know, you're going to destroy that kid's motor patterning, natural motor pattern, and you shouldn't just use that as a warm up to just get the blood moving and what have you. I lean very much strongly to the point that, you know, probably just let the kid run and let it resolve itself up to a point. But obviously, if you're coaching hurdles or you're coaching high jump or pole vault, well, there are things that you need to do. You can't just say go for it, you know, and let's see what happens, because, you know, your kid will kill himself. So breaking it down into its component movements and then reassembling them into hopefully a better model, a final model, but it's all glued together with rhythm. So there's a lot involved in it, and you need to be fairly judicious when you choose a drill. And if you don't know what you're doing, don't do it. Leave it out, or seek advice from someone who does know what they're doing, from a physical therapist or a chiropractor, or somebody that really has a better understanding of human movement than a lot of coaches do.
Yeah, because there is a lot of kind of copycat, like I see this, oh, I'm going to do it, but they don't understand the purpose. And so I'm going to kind of switch here with Doug Kechijian. And Doug, you had written on this, and we discussed this whole thing about drills and are they good, are they bad? What has been your experience, particularly as you get into the rehab and return to play side?
But I think why we're having this conversation is because the internet likes to portray people like everybody's an extremist, right? So if you like, and you're the kind of person who's doing the speed ladder in the pool, you know, that video you showed in the trailer. And if you think that, like, you know, more whole training versus part training is useful, then all you do is scrimmage and short-sided games. You never do any part task training. So I think if you looked at what every coach or therapist on this thread here like actually does with people, it's some kind of a mix between those two extremes. So I think that these like polar extremes that we see in the internet, that's not what's really happening in the real world as far as coaching goes. It's kind of more of a straw man argument. So I think, you know, the term drill can evoke a certain emotional response, but I think or general versus specific ability. So if you take the extreme position and you say that, you know, drills are part task training are useless, like there's no place for them, all we should do is the complete task. The logic behind that is that, you know, the body is this very complex adaptive system, and that it will self-organize to achieve a task in the best way possible at all times. The problem with that logic is that in order for the nervous system or the body to self-organize to complete a task, certain options have to be available. So those are the parts. So if the idea is the whole isn't the sum of the parts, I would concede that that's true, But if you don't have the requisite parts to complete a full movement, then it's very hard to effectively self-organize. So you need to have options to self-organize to complete a task. And I think that's where drills or part task training has a place to help to, cultivate some of the components that comprise the whole. So even though I think that ultimately we should be striving for specificity and creating a training or rehab environment that simulates the tasks that we want to ultimately prepare for, I think there's a time and a place to break up that specific environment into tasks or drills. And if we forget about like track and field or strength and conditioning, because I think sometimes, again, people who identify with those fields, it's hard to look at things objectively. If you look at like the military, right? In the military, the most realistic training scenario is to do what's called a full mission profile, where you have like an enemy force posing as an adversary, and you're basically just trying to simulate the full mission. The problem with only doing full mission profiles is that they're logistically very intensive, and you might not get enough reps in the specific skills to develop yourself. So if you're doing, let's say, like a tactical scenario where maybe you're clearing a room, well, depending on where you fit in the stack of that full mission profile, maybe you didn't get to actually like discharge your gun. Maybe you didn't get to practice shooting enough in that full mission profile to actually develop the full skill. Or, I had a medical background in the military, so if you do a full mission profile, maybe you don't get to practice a procedure that you might have to use in a future mission, because in the full mission profile, it was very specific to performing a certain task. So I think there's a place for that part task training. There's also, ultimately, you want to strive to create that competitive environment. Same thing in fighting or mixed martial arts. If all people ever did was just spar, we'd be watching the UFC or boxing on TV, and it would be like barroom brawling. There would be no skill involved. So that's why any good fighter, they do pad work, they do bag work, they shadow box, they throw combinations, but nobody would prepare for a fight by just shadow boxing or doing pad work. So I think ultimately what it comes down to, and this is something that you always preach, Derek, is you have to coach. So there's no good or bad drills. I think that we should all be striving to do as much drilling or part task training as it takes to achieve the objective that we want. So I think if we avoid the dogmatism, there's a place for both types of thinking. And it really comes down to, it's hard to talk about drills in the abstract. It's really, what drill are you doing? When are you doing it? With whom and why? And if we look at it more specifically, I think it's easier to have the conversation. But as an abstract thing, I think there's a place for drills, as long as it's not a substitute for the full task.
That leads me into Shawn Myszka's work with, looking at what happens, say, on the football field, Shawn, and then what is your process of breaking things down and not making it too unrelatable to the actual thing that's happening, but you want to break it down to a point where you can refine it and make it better?
Yeah, and I want to piggyback off of a couple things obviously said, Derek, not only by yourself and Charlie's words, but also Mike's and Doug's as well, because I think there was a couple key things in there that, that sort of the discussion centers around. Personally, I think we have to, with where your question was directing, for those of you who are unaware, I sort of use the sport movement behavior happening in context as my screen. And so, a lot of times, everything that my individuals do and everything that my players do, I'm trying to investigate based on how it ties back into the problems that they solve on the actual football field on an NFL Sunday, when they're under pressure and anxiety and fatigue and complexity and some of those whole type tasks. Now, there are times, obviously, looking to sort of simulate certain aspects of those respective problems. And I think that's where the whole thing, where the rubber meets the road from one extreme to the other, that sort of Doug explained. At the end of the day, I'm attempting to center my emphasis in my training environments to be one of sort of this big problem-solving endeavor for my respective athletes. So typically when people watch what I do or what myself and the players do together, is we are essentially setting representative tasks simply so they can contain some of that information that the whole task, when they get out on an NFL Sunday, will contain as well. But that being said, it's not that I, completely exist over on that other side, as sometimes maybe I'm pointed or the finger is pointed at me at certain times in order to imply that that's exactly what we do. Because at the end of the day, I have to sort of surf that bandwidth, if you will, that spectrum that Doug talked about, where I can exist in some more of these open type environments where I allow my individuals to go solve problems similarly. Maybe it's in a 1 versus 1 situation. Maybe it's in a 1 versus 3, 1 versus 4. Maybe it's even in a shared affordance type fashion where we're getting and running back in space and they have a blocker or two so we can get some shared affordances simulated. I sort of don't exist in the same realm as many people do because I consider myself a movement skill acquisition coach. So I sort of exist for the NFL player in between maybe their personal trainer or strength and conditioning side and where they're going to exist back out in the football field, especially when they get back with their position coaches and whatnot. So for me, many of my tasks, even if it is a drill per se, I have to ask myself the question, are we directing our attention towards motor performance? So meaning movement skill acquisition or movement skill execution at that moment in time, or are we directing our efforts towards motor learning and movement skill acquisition? Because I think how we utilize activities, how we design those drills will be sort of going off of that goal or that objective. And therefore, there's certain times of the year where I do use more closed activities than I do at other times of the year. Right now, for example, when my guys are in season with their respective coaches, I still work with my guys usually 1 or 2 times a week at minimum. And in those times, I am trying to affect motor performance more than I am movement skill acquisition. And they're getting plenty of effort in more of that open movement problem solving. So I might direct more efforts on the biomechanics, but at the same time, when I am directing my attention on the biomechanics, I always sort of link it back in to this repetition without repetition type of fashion where even some of my more closed activities still have variability or allow for the individual to sort of calibrate their movement around that variability. And so, long story short there, I'm always trying to couple as much as I possibly can the actions back with the perception in this constant circular causality type of fashion so I can hopefully gain more skill for the individual, allow them to own their skill execution, and that drill or that activity that we might utilize to add more context to how they can educate their attention, how they can educate their intention, and then hopefully calibrate their movement around it. But because I'm sort of this constraints-led guy, this representative learning guy, who's consistently talking about perception and action and repetition without repetition, it doesn't necessarily mean that we don't ever use closed activities that are considered by most to be drills. It's just likely that they might be executed in a little different fashion with more problem solving at one of those respective dimensional levels of the human movement system. Again, perception, intention, or action.
I want to get to Tommy Christian. Tommy, the thing I want you to address is you're working with young athletes. What are some of the key things that you're looking at in terms of integrating drills to teach and to retain that skill?
Yeah, well, so often I think, first of all, can you hear my mic okay? Is my sound good? All right.
Your sound is awesome.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think, so often with young athletes, we look at drills in different phases of what we're doing. And in the early part, a lot of it is just body awareness and skill acquisition. You take a young athlete and you have them run. If you were to time them, they'll have a very wide spread on their performance, much more than a more experienced athlete. And there's a lot of inconsistency in how they move rep to rep. And so, in our early phases of working with those young athletes, a lot of times we'll use drills and we kind of break down, drill is, I guess, a big word. You could look at the traditional track drills, which we use, but, we look at drills as anything that we're going to use to help to break down a movement, whether it's acceleration, a first step, lateral movement, agility. And using that drill to break it down into segments. And so with young athletes, often it's really helpful to use, just a position, to get them on the wall, teach them a position, and, maybe in an acceleration position or a lateral movement. And then to progress that drill in a position into actually, maybe some sort of a march, and then to be able to, have these teaching moments to, part of it, is not just using words, but getting them to actually feel what it should feel like when their bodies are moving correctly, when they're hitting kind of what are the key positions that we want them to hit, maybe, in terms of joint angles, body position, postural awareness, and then using the drills. And you have to intermix with the young athlete, obviously. It's always a concern to not lose them, but to keep them engaged, then to take them into some sort of maybe a game-based movement, or just having them sprint and then coming back into the drills. But we find that they're really helpful with young athletes, just as, when we work with experienced athletes.
I use video on basically every rep now. If I could have somebody else do it for me, that would be my dream. Usually it's just me and the troops, and that's the best feedback that they can get, and they will self-organize, the more experienced ones. And if they see good people doing it right, getting rewarded with good times and victories, then a lot of the time they will come to that conclusion. If it looks right, it'll fly right, and they will self-organize. But videos are fantastic, particularly the ones that you can, draw over the top of, sketch over the top, and try to get them to understand that essentially what I'm looking for in sprints is a power pole position. So, whether you're coming off the blocks like that or moving into max velocity like that, there's no break anywhere. There's no leakage. Straighten up, fly right.
Rehab is really, in most cases, about you have to start with the parts, get the parts up to a level where now, as Shawn mentioned, once you get the parts to the level that you want, you've ensured that there is sufficient variability so that now the individual or the athlete can self-organize when you impose certain constraints. But if you try to impose constraints that mimic the athletic or the competitive environment without ensuring that the variability is sufficient or adequate before that, then you're not going to get the kind of self-organization that's going to ultimately pass the eye test. So, short answer to your question is I'm always looking at the part and the whole, but I do start with the whole, because, no one's winning medals or winning games because of how they test on a physical therapy table. It's for how they do a whole movement or an athletic skill. So I want to look at that, but I also want to look at, what could be the limiting factors in demonstrating that motor control or the whole skill.
I should probably let everybody sort of know that I look at things from a perception, intention, and action standpoint, and I believe that those processes sort of create that self-organization that we see from the movement behavioral dynamics. So when an individual organizes a solution to face a respective problem, I'm trying to bring my scale of analysis to sort of investigate that problem-solving process for them. And so when I do then, Derek, I have to determine, or at least speculate, whether it's through my conversation with them, as well as then the lens that I place on the game film itself and break it down from multiple angles and really investigate the problem as much as I do the solution that they organize, to try and see really how they're connecting themselves functionally to that respective problem. And then from there, Derek, what I'm trying to do is determine, is it a perceptual problem? Is it an intentional or decision-making problem? Or is it a biomechanical issue or problem? And I'm trying to sort of fix the whole solution maybe at one of those respective subsystems in it oftentimes. And when you fix or address, I should say, one of those respective subsystems, oftentimes then you see the holistic global movement solution improve as well.
So if you want to teach somebody how to run and they had a knee injury, something Don Chu taught me 30 years ago is that after these knee surgeries, these people people don't have their active range of motion, right? They can't get that heel to the gluteal fold on the backside mechanics. And so a drill, right, quote unquote, that you may use has nothing to do with regards to sprinting. It's to establish the heel back onto the gluteal fold to improve their backside mechanics. So when Mike Hurst gets them as their sprint coach, he doesn't have to worry about that as you go through this rehab process. You may have people that they're fearful to load the leg. And so you may use drills with slight resistance so that they're focusing on the resistance. And therefore, to do that, they've got to put more force into the ground. And they get over this fear of applying force into the ground with this once injured leg. And then now that they can apply force, you can go into the types of things, their heels to their butt, they're putting force into the ground. That's been eliminated. Those drills serve the purpose of setting up the drills you want to use to make them a better sprinter.
And in both situations, I actually referred back to their medical and strength and conditioning staff because I didn't know the players well enough. I saw that there was a positional deficiency for a player in each of these squads, but I didn't know if it was injury history, mobility, stability, strength issues. I just knew that they couldn't hit the positions and it was showing up on film in their play. So from a skills perspective, they were unable to or unwilling to put themselves in certain positions for whatever reason. So I think in the best possible scenario that, the skills department is integrated into the performance department. And we can go back through those coaches and say, what do we believe is this challenge? Because was it 3 years ago, there was a very similar situation in NFL preseason camp. Noticed the player could not hit position. 3 weeks later, he's done for the season with hip surgery. And it was glaring in the film. We could see it as soon as we tried some of the body position we were trying to access. So if it's not going back both ways, we're probably all in trouble.
No, I try to keep a very open mind and not be stuck in what I was taught initially, and try to take every individual instance with its own context and each person with their own experience, and try to really investigate what movement experiences they've had. Are they successful? Because we try not to fix anything that isn't broken. And just, we understand that some people are just out there on that, standard deviation, and they're successful with what they do. And how can I best help them to continue to be more successful, or how can I best support what they're trying to do, or can I give them something that's going to be helpful? So it just really depends on the situation, and how much time you have to do that. Just try not to be too rigid in what you do, and try to keep an open mind and learn from a lot of different avenues, and keep your toolbox healthy and expansive, and give the human body the chance to do what it's capable of doing. And certainly don't give anyone mental or emotional reasons to not think they can do something.
I think one of the questions that you kind of sent for us to think about is, do we have enough drills, or, should we look at additional, or maybe, creating additional drills? And I think we should learn from each other and learn from what has been effective over time. But I do believe that there's always there's always room to, specific to the individual, specific to the situation, to create drills that accentuate, a part of the movement that maybe an athlete is struggling with. And being creative, I think, is a fun part of being a coach, and thinking outside the box sometimes. I mean, if we're always outside the box, we're probably in the wrong spot, but I think there's times where really looking at the individual needs of an athlete and seeing a problem, and maybe addressing our own toolbox of drills. And if there's not something there, to feel free to, try something and see if it works. And, some of the things that we do that I think maybe are, maybe unique or certainly not necessarily learned, came as a result of trying to solve a problem with an athlete at some point. And we're like, you know what? We had a guy who could never get hip extension on his first step, and we did this drill, training him for the combine, and it fixed it, and so now, that's in our toolbox of like, you know what, somebody's struggling with that. That's something to try, and whether it resonates with that athlete makes the change. I love drills. I think what I've been challenged more to do is to not always start with drills, but like, a lot of the, panelists have said, start with the movement, see what's wrong, and then come back into the drills. And I think, that can be a helpful way to use them, and maybe something that I feel like I'm growing in as a coach more lately.